part of our think tank work, we have done this report on what we see as some of the greatest innovations that are going on in philanthropy in the world. So what I want to do is to go through a little bit today about why we believe innovation in philanthropy is so important. Why can't we just keep doing what we've been doing? I'll give you a bit of background to the research and how we did it and the methodology, and then talk through the main trends that we found, and also highlight some of the key examples. So we did a mixture of both identifying some key trends within the philanthropy innovation, but also pinpointed a number of great projects around the world that we think are examples of best practice. And really the idea of this was to help try and see what innovations could be spread elsewhere that are being developed, say, in the US or Canada or elsewhere, and that could be spread around the world. So hopefully everything that we chose has an element of replicability about it. And then I'll open it up to the Q&A. I'm really interested to hear all your thoughts on innovation, what you are seeing within your own countries, some trends that we may have missed, some thoughts you have about how these innovations can spread further. So it'll be very interesting to hear your questions, but also your opinions as well. So just to start, can you see the presentation moving? Is that correct? Does that work?
Yeah, Plum, it's working. Perfect.
Okay, good. Okay. So the reason we believe innovation is so important within philanthropy is that we're obviously seeing the world changing very fast, and there is innovation within all key areas. But certainly within the UK, and there's obviously very good data in the UK and less good data in other places, we're not seeing levels of giving rising as much as we'd have hoped. And at the same time, we are experiencing a world where problems are certainly getting more complex, but I think also social problems are probably getting worse. As there's a reduction in government funding and aid, for example. And philanthropists really play a tremendous role here in helping to solve some of these social issues. You know, they can take risks, they can move with agility, they can join forces. There's all sorts of things that they can do, and many are doing so. But it was very much our sort of belief before we started the report that particularly foundations, I think, and individuals need to be encouraged, I think, to think differently, to do things in a more pioneering approach in order to maximize social impact, because ultimately that's what we want to do at the end of the day. And we've created this kind of framework which lay behind a lot of the work we did on innovation, which was looking at how do you maximize social impact, and seeing there are two steps towards this. One was about trying to make sure that more money was being donated, more money was flowing into the sector, and the second, that the money that was coming into the sector was then better donated or invested. And each of those has have a number of elements that I think that are sort of causal factors that will enable more money to be donated. So, for example, if more donors have better information about charities, or they really enjoy the experience, they're more likely to put more money into the sector. And similarly on the other side, in terms of money being better donated, if donors understand needs and funding gaps, or can kind of make the process much smoother, that can really increase effectiveness and mean that the money that is in the system can be better used. And both of those really are for maximizing social impact, with the finite and limited resources that we have as a whole to put to this area. So that is why innovation is so important. It's really about trying to find things that are going on that are working to encourage one or more of those factors that will ultimately help more or better money come into the sector. So what is the innovation in philanthropy? How do you describe innovation in philanthropy? We looked at various definitions, but one that I think works well is the innovation being the process of applying information, imagination, and initiative to produce greater value from resources. And that's what we really feel is so key. It's deriving greater value from the same amount of resources. And when you think about what that really means for philanthropy, I think in some countries where philanthropy is at a much earlier stage, innovation seems to be much more about the replication of developed techniques that are being adapted to a local context to help spread philanthropy. So there were lots of interesting developments that we found in going on in Latin America or Africa, but very few of those were really kind of groundbreaking. And it would be interesting to hear from you if we thought there were any that were missed. So that it seems as if much more what was happening in those areas where philanthropy as a whole was less developed was the replication of already established models that had started in other countries. So we tried not to focus on those areas which was about replication, but really on the sort of more novel or groundbreaking approaches. And before I go through the key trends, there were a number of common themes that ran across all the innovations that we found. The first was really the fact that donors today want a greater engagement with the charities and with the beneficiaries themselves. They want to see the difference they're having. And to some extent, technology is making this easier to do. The second theme is the desire to seek greater impact, either through their grants or with a wider variety of assets. They're looking for scalable, results-driven solutions. The third is around collaboration. Joining forces really can be one way of creating greater impact and make it a whole lot more fun. Giving can be quite a lonely activity, which is rarely kind of discussed, but giving together can bring like-minded people with a passion for a particular cause to great effect. And then finally, we found that innovation is being driven often, not always, but often by new players in the sector. So, for example, we're seeing wealth creators turning their hand to social problems. One of the trends that we picked up in the report was lean philanthropy. This concept of lean startups, which is very prevalent across the technology sector, and how that's being applied to the social sector. So it's really about testing and experimenting new ideas with a small amount of funding, knowing that lots might not work first time, rather than investing a significant time and effort to develop something and then find it fails. And it's interesting to see that some funders are now applying this kind of approach to their grant making. The one that we identified as one of the 10 projects was the Knight Foundation's Prototype Fund in the US. It is really about high risk and high reward philanthropy, moving away from sort of more strategic philanthropy that has been the common theme over the past decade or so, which is really about funding very safe and established programs. There were also some surprises to us when we did the research. But there were certain things that we thought would dominate, but actually they didn't. And one of those, for example, is that innovation in philanthropy is not all dependent on technology. Yes, digital developments are enabling some important initiatives, but almost half of the 10 concepts that we spotlighted are in no way at all reliant on technology. And the second thing that surprised us is that it is not all about social investment either. Social investment, impact investment, whatever the wording used in your own region, it certainly is taking up most of the headlines, but we don't see it as the panacea to solving all the world's greatest problems, and that there are other ways of creating great results. And I think a couple of the examples that I talk through in a minute that don't have social investment at all at their heart are good examples of how to create really great results in different ways. There were a few other areas that we explored, but we didn't find much traction. One was, the rise of the sharing economy and companies like Airbnb and Uber and other such companies that are arriving in the private sector, and whether this was having any impact really in the social sector, and it feels like it's a bit early for that. The second was around gamification, social gaming. and whether the huge rise in use of gaming had any applications in the third sector. And also something that we explored but didn't find a lot that was going on was around education in philanthropy. It may be just too early for these, and if we did this report in another 3 or 5 years' time, maybe they would be the elements that would be highlighted. But it'd be interesting again to hear from many of you whether you are seeing areas in those amongst those themes that are interesting. So, what are the 9 key trends that we found in the report? And hopefully a lot of you will have read the report or go away and read the report subsequently. And I just want to go through some of these in a very brief amount of detail. So the first is about open data, basically the free use of data and information for a number of reasons, particularly helping funders and charities identify areas of need based on socioeconomic trends, gaps in service provision, or how funders can find effective charities. We're going to discuss one particular sort of example in a minute, which is WASH funders within the water and sanitation sector. But I think there's a lot going on in this area, this field of open data and big data, and how that can be better used. But also, I guess it partly relates to how there is increasing pressure on governments and regulators to open up NGO data as a whole, and the benefits that would bring the sector. Second theme is transparency. There's obviously a lot of pressure for foundations to open up their books for others to learn from. And obviously there's a wide variation, as you'll all know, between transparency in different countries. Some are far ahead. Places like the UK, indeed, the US, Canada, seem much further ahead in terms of transparency. Other countries with very little that's happening. It was interesting to note the China Foundation Centre and what that's doing with its transparency index. So there are some new things happening in other countries as well. But I think transparency is going to be increasingly called for, I think, within our sector, particularly if donors are expecting charities to be accountable and to demonstrate their results. Then I think increasingly the public will also expect transparency from foundations as well, to understand what they're doing, the impact of their grants. But I think it's not just about an expectation, it's also about the benefits that transparency can really bring through the sharing of information, the increased credibility, the better relationship with grantees. There's a range of different things. But I think transparency is a very key trend, and we picked out Glass Pockets and the work that they're doing as a key example there. Learning from failure, third example, really about where organisations, where funders have defined their objectives and then seen if they've been met. So there's quite a lot of this being talked about, but not very publicly. And the example we've highlighted was the Shell Foundation in the UK, which published a report on its grantees, which showed that in their early phases of grant making, they had an 80% failure rate of their grantees not meeting their objectives, and that they changed their strategy and moved to an 80% success rate by 2010. There are a few other foundations doing that, but it still seems rare. Lean philanthropy, I've already mentioned. Collaboration, I'm going to talk much more about in a minute, so I'll leave that one. Balancing funder power. This is really about a shift in power away from donors towards grantees or beneficiaries, who it might be suggested often know better how to allocate resources rather than the funders themselves. So it's interesting to see how funders are engaging both their grantees through things like grantee perception reports, but also beneficiaries themselves to develop funding programs. And we've again given an example of a UK fund organisation that's doing that. 100% impact investing I will talk through in a minute in more detail. Layered funding, this is really about, I think there are lots of different terminologies and definitions of this, but it's really about different types of investors with diverse risk appetites coming together to fund projects. and we used the Good Start deal in Australia that really helped bring in new resources into the sector, into the philanthropy sector as a pioneering approach. And then finally, online giving markets, which I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with. And there are obviously lots of different types, but the one that we focused on was Better Place in Germany, where we particularly liked its kind of Amazon-style ratings of projects by donors, and again, based around transparency. And I think it's worth saying that a lot of these themes can be kind of combined together to be quite powerful. I'll talk about that a little bit in more detail. So how did we actually do the research and come up with these innovations? We did a whole lot of desk research, and we then spoke to 18 leading philanthropy experts around the world. And I think some of you obviously were included in that. So we spoke to IDIS, and there's a range of different people that you'll see in the back of the report that very much helped to contribute. We spoke to someone from every continent and very much gathered everyone's opinions. We had to narrow the scope quite considerably, so we very much focused on how people fund, but not what they fund. We focused on the giving of money, but not really of time. And we focused on giving by foundations and individuals, not corporates and governments. We found an incredible number of interesting things that were going on, and we had a sort of shortish list of 42 interesting initiatives, and we then narrowed those down to the final 10, depending on a number of things, particularly around how likely they were to have an impact on improving philanthropy. So it goes back to that original framework. How much did each project actually kind of contribute to either more money coming into the sector or money being better spent? The second point was about their ability to be replicated or scaled up. We were particularly looking at that with a UK context as to whether it existed here and whether it had applications to be scaled up here. But I think that's very much applicable to anywhere in the world. And we then went back to our experts to get their favourites, which we've highlighted. So we had a sort of expert top picks, and I'm going to highlight three of those now. There are also a few innovations that we found that didn't quite make our top 10 list, but were on there's a page called the 3 innovations to watch that weren't, they were still at a relatively early stage, but we think are really interesting. And they include projects such as mirror funds, GuideStar's mirror funds in the US, which is really about mirroring other foundations that are allowing people to donate according to the style of, say, the Gates Foundation, and Bridge as well, which I know lots of you online hopefully are very familiar with, but the global database of NGOs and having a unique identifier around that each organisation. Again, in the efforts of transparency and open data. So that's the background really to the research. And what I want to do finally here is just talk about 3 specific examples before I move on to the final section of really what does it take for innovation to spread. So the first example I want to talk through is, and these are all one of the experts' top picks as well, Dasra Giving Circles. I've already talked about the importance of collaboration, and it definitely runs across a variety of the selected innovations. And this isn't just about donors pooling their funds together or giving together, but it's also it's about the sector making strides in sharing infrastructure and data or creating common standards. But the one that we were interested in was Dasra's Giving Circles. Many of you may be very familiar with this model, but it's interesting that what they've done is, obviously giving circles have existed for decades in different forms, but this particular type was started in India in 2010 by the organisation called Dasra. And how they work is that they get 10 philanthropists together, each focused on a specific area. They then have to commit around $50,000 over 3 years. There's then a long period of 8 to 12 months of sector research that goes on within the focus area to really identify the funding gaps, to really work out what are the different approaches, who are the good organisations working in that field. So it's very, very much evidence and sector research based. They then do due diligence on some shortlisted organisations, and they choose one organisation to fund, but also to provide with capacity building support from Dasra so that they can scale up this organisation. And they work in a variety of different sectors, in toilets and sanitation, in malnutrition, in girl empowerment. And what we love is the way that they have kind of evolved Giving Circles into this very research-based. They have adapted it to the local context, which is in India much more about a mistrust of charities and organisations and a lack of good information. To really overcome that by providing really strong research and due diligence and good information, so that the best impact can possibly be gained. And obviously, I think that is something that could be easily replicated in other countries, in other sectors. The second key example is one in open data. As I talked about, open data is a very big theme, I think, at the moment in philanthropy, and an exciting one. I think it has a power to really change things. And we really liked WASH Funders, which is obviously an initiative run by the Foundation Center in the US, established in 2011. I'm aware that I think there may be someone from the Foundation Center on the call, so please do correct me if I'm saying anything that's not right. But for those of you that aren't familiar with WASH Funders, it's an online portal for the water, sanitation and hygiene sector, for use not only by funders but also all sorts of NGOs, policymakers, researchers, and it incorporates a number, up to 17, I think, different data streams to create this interactive mapping tool, and to really see the funding flows. Who is funding what and where in that sector of water and sanitation? But not only is it about funding flows, it's also about funders sharing their case studies that show their successes or challenges, tools and resources to evaluate projects within the water and sanitation sector. And again, we have one of the foundations that we are the outsourced grant makers for, that fund up to around £4 million a year in water and sanitation. So one of the key funders in the area, and they find this a really, really valuable resource when they're helping the foundation make good funding decisions. And again, I think is easily adapted to other sectors. And I think here it's a really good example of a combination of all these trends. I've sort of specified that it's under open data, but really it's a combination of open data, transparency and collaboration, all leading to quite a powerful combination within that area. And then the final project that I want to highlight is the theme of 100% impact investing. I don't obviously need to explain to any of you about impact investing, but it lies behind a number of our innovations and our projects, but not all of them. But for those of you that don't know, the KL Felicitas Foundation, the couple behind it are Charlie and Lisa Kleisner, who made their money in Silicon Valley in the 1990s, started their own foundation in 2000, and quickly realized that they would make the most of their limited resources if they aligned the whole of their endowment with their social mission, rather than just distributing the 5% of assets in grants each year. So they have spent the past 10 years or so, and it's taken them really quite a long time to get there, to make sure that they are achieving a social or environmental return across their entire endowment in all the different asset classes, whether that's cash, bonds, equities. So, for example, on cash, their cash is deposited with small community development banks supporting local social enterprises or entrepreneurs, rather than just in any other bank. What's also interesting about them is they are not just doing this with their own foundation, but they are also helping others do the same. And they've published detailed information about the financial returns that they've achieved with their portfolio, which in itself is quite unusual, to show that it is possible to receive a market or better financial return, but whilst also targeting a social or environmental impact. And then they've also created a 100% impact network, which now has around 40 family offices and individuals and foundations with combined assets of, I think, growing now close to $4 billion US dollars. And each of those members have committed 100% of their assets to positive or social or environmental impact at some stage in the future. So those are the three examples that I wanted to bring out today. And I think just in kind of summary and closing, really wanted to stress again how important we think innovation in philanthropy is, given the huge inequality and the rising inequality that there is in the world. And we believe that, you know, if some of the more progressive approaches from the world can be adopted, we can make much more of these limited resources, much better use of these resources. One observer that has read our report has commented that a lot of the underlying themes that we have chosen, for example, giving circles, or the need to learn from failures, or funding experiments, have actually been around for decades, i.e. the Ford Foundation used layered funding back in 1981 to seed Grameen Bank. And they're really asking, why have innovations spread so slowly, and what are the impediments to change? Is it partly about the lack of funding for issues to fix the sector, i.e. sort of philanthropy infrastructure or database building? What is it? What are the challenges that are stopping this kind of spread of some of these more pioneering approaches? And I'm not sure I've got the answer to that, but we do see that there are kind of three key ingredients that are necessary in order to develop innovations and spread innovations. The first is one of openness. I think the sector we work in, sadly, still has a lot of people working in silos, working in isolation, to some extent competing. And yet, you know, there's so much that can be gained through sharing information, sharing data, learning lessons. And I think it's very much the old saying, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. And I think that ingredient of openness is really, really important. The second is leadership. And I think here is really where philanthropists can make a difference. Often, particularly with family foundations, they don't have accountability to anyone other than themselves. And therefore, it's often why do they need to take risks and disrupt the process if they don't really need to? But where they do, and where where it's so exciting, is to find people like the Kleisners who could just do it a very traditional way and give away their money sort of on a 5% payout ratio each year in a much more standard way. But to see them really pushing the boat out and seeing how they can experiment takes a lot of effort, a lot of time, a lot of resources, but also a lot of leadership as well to try and encourage others to do the same. And finally, confidence. You know, you need to be quite brave to break with traditions and try new methods. There is a chance that you'll fail, particularly at first, but it takes confidence that by trying something new and taking risks, that might eventually yield far greater results. So I haven't had time to go into the other sort of key innovations, and there are lots more examples, but I'd really love to hear from you now, if we open it up to a sort of Q&A session, as to the thoughts that you have on the trends that you're seeing in your own countries. What do you believe are the challenges to innovation? What do you think needs to be done to spread further? Or just some interesting ideas that you might have around this field. So can I open it up now to Q&A to hear all your thoughts? Thank you.
Thank you, Plum. Thank you so much for such a wonderful and inspirational presentation. For the Q&A, what we can do is that people can either send the question directly to you or to me, and I can redirect it. Or if it's better, people can raise their hand, and we can unmute them so they can ask the question via the microphone. So whatever is better.
Okay, so we received some questions. The first one that I will read now is, the report was based on a team of experts that identified also the trends and the innovations. The questions would be, what were the teams of experts that helped identifying the trends and also the innovations?
Okay, so I think as I understand it, the question is, who were the experts that we asked? And as I said, on page 30 of the report, we list all the experts that we spoke to, but they include people like Lucy Bernholtz from the US, currently a Stanford scholar, very much based a lot of her work around open data. We included IDIS, obviously from Brazil, who I think there are several of you on the line, but we spoke to Paula and Marcos from IDIS. We spoke to GuideStar, we spoke to Monitor in India, we spoke to Social Ventures Australia, we spoke to Wise in Switzerland, King Baudouin in Belgium. So a variety of different people that we perceive are kind of experts in the field. Does that answer the question, or was there something else?
No, that's great. That's exactly what it was asked. Going to another question that was sent. The question is this. You said that the resources are essential for the creation of innovation, but to organizations that don't have this kind of resources, financial resources, what do you think of the role of social media and the internet as a whole?
So I think this is an interesting question, and I think really it's one that goes back to the scope of the report. What we were looking here was around innovations in the way that people give, and it was really innovations in funding, not social innovations themselves. So I think on the whole, this was looking at people that perhaps do have the resources to do things differently. But I think social media and technology as a whole has an enormous role to play in allowing pioneering approaches that will either get more money into, particularly around getting more money into the sector, that doesn't necessarily take a lot of resources. A good example of this is crowdfunding, which we didn't necessarily cover in the report, although it's touched upon. But that's a very good example where you can use social media and other forms of internet usage and information passing to really kind of help raise issues for those that don't have many resources. And I think there are some of the other areas that we looked at. So some of the donor giving circles, for example, can be around, can involve individuals really giving quite small amounts of money. It doesn't have to be at a very large scale, but it's really about getting more people engaged with giving, thinking about it together, having fun while they're doing it, getting the rewards out of it. So there's a range of different ways that some of these approaches can be adapted to even those that don't have much resources. And I think social media is a very useful way of playing a role there.
Okay, thank you so much. I would like to do a questions for myself. Wings, along with some organizations, are working to spread the idea of the good utilization and good practices, informations about transparency of organizations. So the budget, their practices, their programs, and their expenditure in order to map the sector. This is the data charter, and what do you think about this kind of practice of encouraging to be more transparent, since you identify as one of the trends?
Yeah, I mean, I really think this is a very key point, and what I think is interesting is trying to find out whether the way to do it and encourage more foundations to become transparent, is that going to happen? Is there enough incentive around the benefits of being transparent, or does there need to be? Do we need to resort to regulation in order to make it happen? And I think it would be a shame if it was the second. It would be nice to see enough people actually realizing that it's in their own interests to be transparent. But there's a huge debate, as you will all be aware, around the role of foundations and them being independent and them being private, and the fact that they are. I think another trend that we identified is the rise in donor-advised funds as an antidote, really, to this kind of rise in transparency. People are still wanting to hide and be opaque and be very private about their giving, and therefore they're setting up donor-advised funds that sit within an umbrella organisation so that they can't be identified and they don't have to give out that information. I think it's a really interesting question. I don't have the answer as to how we can encourage more and more to publish more data, and exactly along the lines that you've said, without having to resort to some kind of regulation. I hope that we can do it just by encouragement.
Okay, so I think we will have, unfortunately, to wrap it up, but it was a great webinar and a great discussion. I think that points have been made about openness, leadership, confidence, and also the new trends in philanthropy that are essential for giving awareness to the innovations that may appear in the future. So I would like to thank you all for being here, and also Plum, really thank you for the whole presentation and the report that is so enlightening. And thank you also Laura for being host. And we have also to remember, if you want to access our the report of NPC, it's available in our Knowledge Center in wingswap.org. Thank you so much, everyone, and hopefully we will see you in another webinar. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much.